We are so excited to carry on the conversation that we were just having. We have today with us author Jeff Yang, who has just written this amazing book. Is it shown on the screen there? The
Yeah.
Golden Screen, the movies that made Asian America. And what we were just talking about and where Tim was going, and I started the recording so that we could get this in, is that all of us of a certain age, no matter what our color is, no matter where we grew up, we have a foothold, we have a toehold in a moment in the 1970s when a guy named Bruce Lee transcended culture, transcended race, transcended language, and somehow drew flocks of people to his movies and changed the landscape, I think, for everyone at that point in time. And for me, at least, that's where it began. From there, I went into samurai movies and I went into other martial arts movies and everything else. And eventually the Hong Kong New Wave consumed my life. But it all begins with a guy named Bruce Lee for many of us of a certain generation. But what I love about this book, and Jeff, I'll let you jump in here and talk about this. This is not about Asian movies. This is not about Hong Kong movies. It's not about martial arts movies. This is about, it's not even chronological per se. You've kind of wrapped your arms around something that I think until now nobody really thought was possible. It is a thematic breakdown of the Asian experience, the Asian American experience, and how it intersects with cinemas all over the world. It's a huge thing to tackle. I'm amazed that you even that you dreamed it, much less pulled it off. What was the genesis of this book? What was the genesis?
Well, the genesis, depending on how far you go back, probably starts very similarly to the genesis, the origin stories, if you will, that you guys had. I had a disreputable uncle who was supposed to be watching me after school. And instead of actually taking me somewhere where I could study and do my homework, he'd actually sneak me down to Chinatown and to a place called the
Oh, don't
Music
you just
Palace.
love those uncles?
They're the best. And we'd sit and watch double features until my parents were ready to pick me up from where I was supposed to be. Right? We'd sort of like spend afternoons just watching people kick and flail on screen, watching romantic comedies and slapstick, watching and reading these films from Hong Kong that broke and then rebuilt my brain, because nowhere else in the world around me was I seeing heroes or even just protagonists that looked like me. And this opportunity to reach out across to the other side of the world and tap into this new lifeblood, this new wellspring of just electric energy. Uh, it set me on the course not just for my love of cinema, but my desire to eventually be a part of it, to not necessarily creating films, but yeah, watching them, commenting on them, critiquing them, observing them. I I sort of liken it in some ways to uh, a rebirth, right? I mean, almost literally, in the sense that the cinema experience, when you're just sort of sitting there in the dark, right? It's such a solo experience, such a unique experience for each of us. But there are these sort of brief moments where everybody laughs at the same time or screams or goes ooh or ah, where you realize you're part of an audience. And then you emerge out of that audience and you see people's faces for the first time and you realize you're part of a community. And that to me, I think, was the forging of, I guess, the beginnings of what will become my adult identity, both as an Asian American and ultimately as a culture critic. So that's the early beginning of the book. But then, of course, many years later, Xander Kim, an editor at Hush Hat Books, reached out to me and said, you know, I mean, you've written a lot about these things for various publications. You've done books adjacent to this, but this really feels like the moment to just, as you said, wrap your arms around the bounty that is Asian and Asian American cinema, cinema of the Asian diaspora, to try to make sense of it. And I want to do a book on that. Is it something that you'd be interested in doing? And I said, I've been waiting for this my entire life. That's the
That's
beginning.
I love the way that your book is constructed. These 8 chapters,
Yeah.
and each of them has its title across the diaspora. Just what you were just talking about. A talk with Janet Yang and
Mm.
Bowden, and you do a talk with Daniel Kwan. I love the way it's structured. Talk to us a little bit about how you decided to do that structure
Mm.
and about whom to have those talks with.
It's really interesting because in that conversation about what the book was going to look like, how it was going to be organized, there were a couple different ways we could go. We could have done a chronological, this is the history of Asian cinema in the US type of a book, which probably would have appealed to cinephiles, folks like us, people who really cared about it in that historical frame, if you will. Or we could have done it as like a film encyclopedia where it was alphabetical, right? Begin with whatever movie begins with A, and then kind of continue on until Z. And uh, what I told my editor was, I actually felt the most important thing to do was to focus the book on the experience of the movies, on the audience, and how these movies landed on us. Because just like you guys said, these movies brought us together, whether we were Asian or not. Right? These are the things that, for many people, framed what it meant to be Asian, because that's all we could see. Right? Whether they were Asian films or Asian American films or Hollywood films with Asian people in them, America saw us as who we were based on what was on screen. And for a long part of that history, it was kind of a mixed bag, to say the least.
Yeah.
So that was the choice to organize around kind of 8 key themes. Like films about family, films about immigration, films about the social structure of society, films about the dark side, and films about, obviously, conflict. All these things were things which, if you look at these films, start to come together, because over time you see that the way that Asians have been depicted on screen through these different lenses changes, because the way that people see us as Asian Americans or as Asians in the United States change. And it's a conversation back and forth. And then once those themes were set, I did reach out to people who I felt had really interesting things to say about making films for those audiences or making films around those themes, to serve as kind of like, the navigators in some ways as to why it is that those themes ended up becoming so important to the way that Americans sort of cinematically depicted and saw Asians in the United States.
I felt like it's a syllabus in many respects, right? And I say that in a positive way. Like, a syllabus when you're in college, it gives you that overview. You get a sense of, here's where I'm going. This is my roadmap from where I am now to where I'm going to be at the end. And you open up the index of this thing, and I'm like, I get it. This is my roadmap. These are the themes. These are the subjects. And then, an unbelievable amount of films that
Mm.
you include as to support your theses, which I think is the most wonderful part of it. And people should know, this is not, I mean, you've got Star Trek 6 in here. You go, and to your great credit, you don't leave off the subcontinent, right? That often gets left out. When people talk about Asian films, they tend to leave India, Pakistan, Bangladesh out of the equation. That's a separate thing. It's its own deal. And you don't. You go
Hollywood and
there.
all that, yeah.
And even with that diaspora, Harold and Kumar is in this thing. So you really, really kind of pull the whole subject in a really, really compelling way. And I love where you go with all of these. Um, I remember, and tell me what you think of this too,
Mm-hmm.
because I remember one of my great gripes for a long time was that Asian films could get nominated for the foreign language Oscar. They never won. And the only reason they created that category was because the Samurai trilogy got those special awards in the 1950s. And then as soon as they created a category, no Asian film won until Crouching Tiger. And I wrote a piece for the LA Times that
Mm.
year, basically pointing this out and saying, this committee has a problem. This award has a problem. And I think it stems from the fact that people still have this phobia about an area that dragged us to war 3 times in 4 decades. And, the 80s was the first time that a couple of generations didn't have a war that took place across the Pacific. And finally, we broke that down, and now we've got Parasite, which broke every previous taboo. Talk a little bit about the process of getting from there, where these films were really for a specialized audience,
Mm.
now where you can't find somebody who doesn't love a Korean show on Netflix.
Oh yeah, I mean, it is incredible actually the way that the idea of reading movies, of watching foreign films with subtitles, has been normalized over the decades. And absolutely, I would put kind of two big markers there. The first being the 70s, when people really started engaging with and experiencing martial arts cinema for the first time, right? Although a lot of people watched it dubbed, there was the sort of, the subculture of people who sought out or primarily watched films in subtitled form. And then the second beat really was, I think, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Although, it was what I would call a lesson unlearned. I'll come back to that. But I think your point about how social circumstances impact the screen and vice versa is really important, right? The fact that Asia is a continent that has essentially been the source for virtually all of this nation's wars, right? The wars that at least weren't with other people on the North American continent or with itself, America, right? Uh, have mostly been fought with Asian countries. And that really does reinforce the the kind of slow breaking down of exclusion that has occurred since the very beginning of Asian immigration to the United States. I mean, there was a good 60-year period where it was actually literally illegal for Asians to immigrate to the U.S., right, or to naturalize as citizens if they were here already, and that exclusion, which began with the Chinese Exclusion Act and continued and expanded into the quote unquote Asiatic barred zone, it did not block all influence from Asia, but it did screen it. It made it so that everything coming from Asia came from abroad. It felt exotic and strange. It was interpolated or translated or kind of synthesized in some ways for American consumption. And so, actual authentic experience of what Asia and Asian cultures felt like were very rare. And they did feel foreign. And the fact that the Motion Picture Academy had to create a foreign language category uh, reflects the fact that they did not feel like you could compare apples to lychee. You know what I mean? That the film coming out of Asia was so foreign, so different that it was kind of implausible to see Asian cinema in Asian languages with Asian performers placed side by side with those with white actors speaking English, etc. And then, as you noted, once it created that category, they still gave it to the kind of closest thing to Hollywood cinema that they could find that was not in English. Right? It was always like European films for the longest time. Uh, I chalk that up not just to the kind of the retrograde sensibility of America, the sort of nascent nativist sensibility that we still see erupting every so often, but also just the practical sense that for a long period of time, Asians just again were not there. We were a tiny minority in America, and our culture uh, was very clearly imported in tiny little driplets, right? Um, and again, in ways that people wouldn't recognize. I'm just going to toss out one last thing on that. I mean, one of the biggest turning points before everything became K-pop, right, in America was the arrival of Japanese animation, right? And this actually began in the late 70s and early 80s, but we didn't know about it because it was redubbed and everything was changed. All the names and characters, all the cultural motifs were erased in many ways and replaced with kind of familiar ish American analogs or Western analogs. because the fear was that audiences would freak out if they had to be exposed to something that was exotically different in the midst of their science fiction narrative, their robot story, their whatever. And it took until the 90s, and then, arguably even the 2000s, before people started saying, wait a second, this thing we call Robotech is actually assembled from three different,
Mm.
completely unrelated series out of Japan that just happen to have sort of similar animation. And somebody wrote an entirely different plot with totally new character names and everything in order to essentially, you know, uh, build a bionic storyline that Americans could consume. And that was the level of acceptance for Asian culture for a long time. It had to be pre-chewed, right? And then kind of like regurgitated back on screen in some very different fashion.
That
Interesting.
is that's an interesting point, and I, on a certain level, I'm grateful and fortunate that growing up in Los Angeles, we had UHF television channels and channels like KWHY, channel 22, where I could watch a lot of this stuff. I mean, but yeah, it took years before I realized that Battle of the Planets was originally Gotcha Man. Things like that. You sort of do, you still learn, but it's worth pointing out that as we speak right now, there was a question in the theaters: what's going to fill theaters? Because all the Hollywood movies moved out of the way because of the strikes. So the holiday season, what's going to fill theaters? You know what the theaters went to? They went to The Boy and the Heron and Godzilla. Two Japanese films are burning up the box
Yeah.
office, and it's kind of amazing, and everyone is suddenly realizing, wow, you don't need Marvel superhero movies to bring people to the theaters. You don't even need American movies. They make movies in Japan too. How about that? I mean, any thoughts about that?
I I love the fact that these two beats of almost like darkened screens, right? One being COVID, right, and the 2 years of the pandemic, and the other being the Hollywood strike, forced people in a lot of ways to overcome some of their resistance again to expanding their entertainment diets to include the whole world. I mean, yes, Asia especially, because after America, if you look to the rest of the world, uh, the most abundant trove of undiscovered frontier really still, in terms of developed entertainment markets, cinematic markets and the like, uh, is in Asia. And of course, people already had their appetites a little bit whetted because K-pop was already starting to break down doors. But we get to a point now where during the pandemic, people kind of ran out of content to binge, and all of a sudden they started like doing the equivalent of clicking the dial up to the upper register back when there used to be dials, right? They started kind of going into the deeper cuts of Netflix and other platforms and discovering stuff, which like, wait a second, this stuff is pretty cool. uh, and when the doors opened after the pandemic and people kind of were released into the general population again, as it were, I think tastes had been bent enough that people were willing to be much more expansive about what they would experiment with. And so again, the strike ended up actually being a unique opportunity to test whether people would not just watch this stuff on streaming platforms with a click of a finger, but pay for tickets. And I think the answer is yes. I would also argue this though, and Tim, this is something I want to ask you about because I feel like while kind of the mainstream of American entertainment consuming audiences have been kind of late in discovering Asian cinema. One of the things that I see when I go back to friends of mine and ask what were the first movies you watched, right? Especially the first non-Hollywood movies you watched. I will say this: like black audiences discovered Asian cinema way before anyone else, and all of the movie theaters that I used to go to, even back in like the 80s and 90s, which were playing Hong Kong cinema and the like, the only the only people there, other than like old Chinese ladies eating dried squid and gangsters with pagers, were African American folks who had actually watched, in many cases, uh, a lot of these films on like badly dubbed VHS tapes and the like, right? And to me, it's like the theatrical audience has only now started to acknowledge that more the people who are watching movies, it's Latinx people, it's African Americans, it's Asian Americans, by far and away are watching more movies per capita than any other group in the United States. And a big reason for that is in for a lot of us, we kind of got trained into having this sort of expansive movie diet from very, very young, for that very reason.
Just because you very often had to, and what you say I think is true, and it's a thing that I notice in Black culture, African American culture, going back quite a ways. Some of it I'm just old enough to have actually experienced, right? So certainly what we talked about with Bruce Lee and all of that stuff in the early '70s, but actually even before that. A lot of folks coming out of World War II, and for that matter, Korea and Vietnam, a lot of African American men went into the military. I was one of those men in the late '70s, but even preceding me. And in the military, we were shipped to all kinds of places all over the world. I spent some part of my military career in Korea. I was in Busan and Ulsan. I was in the Philippines at Clark Air Force Base. In the early 1980s, and in these communities and cultures, these men experienced all of these. I did not know anyone, any brother who came back from any of those theaters in Asia that did not come back partly Japanese, partly Korean, partly Vietnamese. They had the jacket, they had the sword. They came back with a philosophy from literally having been there and traveled around, and they brought the culture back with them. These are a lot of my uncles and older cousins in the late '60s and early '70s. And then this happened again, like I said, with cats like me. I went in the Air Force in 1979 and spent years in all of these places. And so in the early '90s, when I come to Los Angeles, and all of these movies represented in your book, and particularly the ones in that wave from the early '90s, which was just extraordinary. Because one of the things you talk about, for instance, Lost in Translation, which is actually the early 2000s in the book. Lost in Translation has always been a movie that I love. Sofia Coppola's movie, 2003. But you talk about how it hit differently in the Asian community. As a brother, I've watched many movies from Hollywood, and I'm watching these movies, and I'm seeing all my people, but I'm like, this movie's hitting all different in the Black community. We're having a whole different conversation about this movie over here than and this is one, Lost in Translation, and I think it's really sort of interesting the way you talk about that. And frankly, a bit of an education. That was an education for me about how that movie that I adore hit differently in the community. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So it is quite interesting because, on the one hand, just as a cultural critic, I admire Lost in Translation as a work. I do think that I understand why it hits so deeply for many people as this sort of pay-in to alienation, dislocation, the sense of like not belonging, not being a part of the world. And frankly, those are the things that I recognize in when watching the movie for myself, but on the other side of the world, right? Like I've felt that way in Staten Island, New York, which is where I grew up. But at the same time, if you can imagine, if I did a Lost in Translation set in Staten Island, and I just surrounded myself with nothing but folks from like the Jersey Shore reality series, right? In order to prove this point out that the world around me was absurd and ridiculous and alienating, and maybe a little bit monstrous. That's kind of the experience that if you're Asian, and especially if you're Japanese American or Japanese, that sitting in a theater in the United States watching that feels like. And I feel like that's part of the reason why I wanted to focus strongly on this notion of the experience of consuming movies, of watching movies, because ultimately stories aren't just what are told, they're what's heard. They're what's felt, right? We bring to the movies just as much as the movies bring to us. And that's what really shapes us. That's what really makes us. Uh, I, for Lost in Translation in particular, I think it's really quite interesting because it also brought Scarlett Johansson into sort of like this social conversation regarding where she sits in the culture, both as a bankable female action and comedy and drama star. Right, she's obviously one of the biggest female stars Hollywood has had in recent memory, but also as somebody who has very publicly talked about how she doesn't like the restrictions that are, placed on her by expectations of cultural, appropriateness or appropriation for that matter. And
This goes back to her performance in what was it, Ghost in the Shell? Was it Ghost
Ghost
in
in
the
the
Shell?
Shell,
It's the
yeah.
show.
So this is where the stories get complicated, right? Uh, Even if we talk about them from the vantage point of watching them, there are people on the screen creating them, and it is that conversation, the social conversation around that I think is particularly interesting. From that point of Lost in Translation through to Ghost in the Shell, Scarlett Johansson became like a punchline in the Asian American community as the Asian kind of occupying that empty seat we left aside for a white person in the 21st century. And it's just, to me, I think that's part of what this book tries to do. It tries to say these things don't occupy a vacuum or a space in the darkness alone. We do come out of the theater, and when we do, those stories continue to talk.
Yeah, something happened when we saw these movies. Something happened. There's the intention of the writers, the directors, the performers, and that's all fabulous. And sometimes that intention is on point and exactly and spoken exactly as they mean it. But if you don't have a bigger picture,
Yeah.
particularly of your actual audience, sometimes your intention is not what was spoken to that audience. You
And
said
it,
something else to them, wholly
and
and
it,
completely. And
and it,
it's an interesting to bring up that notion. I think is so important.
and it obviously changes with time and context too. I'm so glad that you just went right at the bullseye with two films in particular, Breakfast at Tiffany's
Mm,
and 16 Candles.
mm.
And I remember even when 16 Candles came out and I saw it, and every girl of that generation, that movie spoke to them. And I had to have that conversation with them and say, yeah, but you realize that guy you're laughing at with the funny name, that is good. That's really insulting. Like, you have to understand, I'm not a girl, so I'm not connecting with Molly Ringwald, but I am a guy of a certain age who goes to the Quo Hua and to San Gabriel to see a lot of movies with Asian audiences. And I'm going to tell you right now, that is very offensive to them. And the same thing with Breakfast at Tiffany's, right? A movie we all grew up on. I love that movie, but you cringe every time Mickey Rooney shows up because it's not needed. And it was added, right? It was a Blake Edwards addendum. It isn't even in the book, that character. Blake Edwards just threw that in there needlessly, and it's just so sad. But I'm so glad you went right at those. I want to pivot for a second to a movie that I'm so grateful that you put in, that you mentioned, Kaio Hata's Picture Bride.
Ah,
And the reason being that Kaio was a TA of mine at UCLA,
wow.
and she was amazing, and I learned so much from her. And then, there were sort of three at the time at UCLA who had success marked all over them, and Alexander Payne was
Mm,
obviously, tops, and then Gina Prince, now Prince Bythewood. Everybody knew those two were going places, and Kaio certainly had it going on as well, and her untimely death just still stings so many of us now that we see where Gina and Alexander have gone.
mm,
She could have been there with them. And I was at Cannes in '94 when she was there with that film, her
mm.
first breakthrough. And we talked then. And I talked to her again just before she died. And it breaks my heart that career was snuffed out. But I'm so grateful that you put that film in the book, because it's so important, because it's there. We talk about you're Japanese or Japanese American. No, there's also Japanese Hawaiian, and
Yeah.
it's a thing unto itself. And she was so proud of being that. And so thank you for putting that in.
I always loved Picture Bride, and not just because I thought the acting was brilliant, not just because I felt it was a special movie telling a unique story that people could have said, "Oh, that's a niche story. That's a story that most people, won't either recognize or connect with." I mean, when I think about people responding that way, I think to myself, so if the people in this story were bright green and had antennae, and you set this on another planet, it would be a mass market film, some sort of like potential blockbuster. But just because they're Asian, Asian Pacific, and on an island that you may or may not have visited in any way other than for tourism, uh, it becomes something that's nuanced and niche and deep and remote. And yes, I mean that's just how humans operate. But Picture Bride in particular, it was a story about history. It was a story about relationships and family. It was a story that is set in a world where I think a lot of people without that film might never have actually been exposed to, might never recognize. And Kayahata absolutely on the back of this film should have been a superstar. And yet, in part because of her untimely passing, she never got that opportunity. And there's more than a few people like that in this book. People who, with their first films, Asian American indie filmmakers especially, just clearly put a dent in the universe. Not everybody went on to make Fast and the Furious films like Justin Lin did, right? A lot of people made their bones and then kind of walked away with just bones. So it's it these are things that you don't see until you bring everything together. And I think that's part of the reason for making a compendium of films like this, to note that Asian cinema is not a genre, right? It's simply a statement of fact. These are films that came from people who are Asian or from the Asian continent. Once you actually look closer, they break down into different genres and subgenres, different themes, very, very different types of and formats of storytelling. But you only see that when you see everything at once.
Yeah, everything everywhere all at once is when you actually see that. When it's all together, the way you have organized it here, we come to understand that there are these there are just many things here that we keep calling Asian cinema.
Mm,
Um, and some of it is Kurosawa,
mm, mm,
Asian cinema, but some of it is American cinema,
mhm.
right? If you're created by these people who are Americans who
Mhm.
are Asian,
Yeah, yeah.
but they're these Americans. They were born here, they're
Mhm,
wherever they were born, but they grew up in whatever community. But they're American, so this is really American cinema.
mhm,
But through, so talk a little bit about that.
mm.
And I don't know if the word difference is correct, but there's Asian cinema, and then there's this cinema made by these Asian people who are Americans. This American
Right.
cinema made by Asian people.
And here's what I would say, right? For the longest time, Asian American creators, Asian American people in general, we took great pains to differentiate. There's Asian stuff over here and Asian American stuff over here. We want to just sort of sit at this fire and coax it. We want people to recognize that we who have a distinctive experience of being Asian in the United States have a story to tell that is unique, right? But things are complicated. Even at the very beginning of cinema's history, a lot of the stars we think of as Asian American probably thought of themselves as Asian. Setsu Hayakawa, Anna May Wong. I mean, they were American stars, but they had very deep roots and connections to Asia as children of the diaspora. They made films in abroad. They made films in other languages, and we as an Asian American community, uh, are only now starting to kind of overcome that feeling that we have to build these tight boundaries in order to ensure that our experience is not erased. Right. One of the things that I regret more, maybe than any other in the book, is that I had to submit the manuscript before I could include the films that came out this past year that showed so much breadth and so much of the spectrum of different kinds of cinema that we're able to make, right? And that still speak to our experience, from Joyride to Shortcomings, and then most of all, perhaps, Past Lives, right? Which is
Yeah.
still in theaters now and which is getting all this acclaim. The reason why I think Past Lives stands out for me is because A, it's truly a film of the diaspora. It's an Asian American film and an Asian film all at once. It is actually being nominated for Best Foreign Language, right? But the filmmaker herself is an Asian American, one of the quote unquote 1.5 generation who came over old enough so they kind of retained a foot in both worlds. And that's what the film is about. The film is about the kind of fluidity and also disconnection that occurs when you do straddle very different sense of consciousness, really, right? Uh, I love the film because for me, it proved that we can actually have a film that's deeply impactful, that doesn't require multiverses, that maybe doesn't even require martial arts, you know?
And Jeff, that crosses beyond that crosses to every immigrant community and
Yeah.
everyone. Look, I'm the child of an immigrant too. I grew up an American father, German mother.
Mm.
So, and I'm the only one of my cousins that doesn't speak German. So, I understand being caught between those cultures. So when I see a movie like Past Lives, when I see especially like The Joy Luck Club, I'm not Asian, but those movies speak to me because there's a universal experience there, right?
Mm.
Um, and I want to take this because this is a really interesting subject. I remember very very well in the early '90s, right when the Hong Kong New Wave exploded here, and Jackie Chan came over, and
Mm.
Jet Li came over, Michelle Yeoh came over, John Woo came over, Choi Huk came over. They were all suddenly doing Van Damme movies, right? And and suddenly, all this entire population of Asian American actors who had been honing their craft with East West players for
Yep.
generations said, well, wait a minute, what about us? We've been waiting for this moment. And suddenly everyone comes over from Hong Kong and they're taking all these jobs from us. And I think a lot of people realize that these were different. It's not, these are different populations. These are different
Mm.
cultures in many respects, that it has fragmented, and not in a bad way, but in a way that needs to be embraced and explored. And I agree with you. I think we're finally getting to that place. Um, Let me start to wrap this up with uh, kind of pivoting to Michelle Yeoh, since we brought
Yeah.
Yeah.
her,
Who wrote the forward, of course.
who
Yes.
wrote the forward. And I've got an interest in my family has an interesting history with Michelle Yeoh. A partner and I, we actually pitched a project for Michelle Yeoh to Terrence Chang before she even came over here. They shot it down. Long story. I'll tell you about it after we're done recording here. But then some years later, after Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, my wife, who was a Bond company consultant, was hired to go over and be the Bond company rep on the set of The Touch.
Ah.
And my and Michelle Yeoh and her husband wined and dined my wife for a whole bunch of days. She had drunken pigeon and things that she had no idea what it was in Hong Kong. She's having a great time. And the very day that she was packing to come home from that movie, the planes hit the towers in New York.
Ah.
So, Michelle Yeoh winning that Oscar,
Mm.
our family history going back, including 9/11, we associate 9/11 with Michelle Yeoh for better or for
Oof.
worse.
Yeah.
But her taking home that Academy Award was a real milestone, I think, for a lot of people. It kind of came on the tail of Parasite and leading into this moment now that
Mhm.
we're having with Godzilla and The Boy and the Heron and everything that's on Netflix. All of this taken in your book, which now comes out at just the right moment, Past Lives is almost certainly going to get a Best Picture nomination as well as a foreign language film nomination. I believe it. I believe it's eligible for foreign language film too. Um, where do we go? What's the future look like? Can
Wow.
you look at a crystal ball?
So I think that the best thing I can say about the future is that more doors are open. There's more possibility than I think many of us who grew up through this period where so many doors seemed slammed in our faces could ever have imagined, right? And a lot of it is actually full circle. We began this conversation talking about Bruce Lee. Well, Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco, an Asian American guy who grew up in Hong Kong, came back, tried to take on Hollywood, found that there was no space for him here, then went back across the ocean to become the biggest star in the world abroad. And he did so, not just with martial arts, although that's what he's best known for, but with this very strong sense of understanding, I think, of what it means to partake of multiple cultures, of being part of the sort of bigger diaspora. I can't find a market here. I'll make a market over there. I think that that is the very beginning, in some ways, of what we think about as Asian American, kind of mass appeal cinema. And at the same time, because there have been so few representations beyond uh, these sort of genre ones for so long, because martial arts was so defining of the consumption of Asian film experience in America for so long, it feels very much like we're only now getting to a point where we can encourage people to go into theaters without seeing those spectacles on screen. Even we mentioned Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the movie that should have changed everything. That movie in 2001 made $100 million. That's like over $300 million today. And yet we still did not see this sort of transformation of Hollywood towards saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe we can put an entire cast of Asians on screen. Maybe we can do movies in other languages. Maybe we can actually capture this lightning that's in a bottle and mass produce it. Instead, we saw them kind of saying, we'll throw a few more martial artists out there and see what happens. Well, I was fortunate enough in the kind of first book of mine that managed to kind of break through. And I say mine, with quotes around it, because I co-wrote Jackie Chan's autobiography before Rush Hour, right? I got to travel with him everywhere else in the world and see people kind of reach out and touch the hem of his robe, like recognizing him everywhere from, Eastern Europe to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, uh, you know, Africa, everywhere in Asia, people knew who he was. And then when I came back here to America and out here to Los Angeles with him, no one knew who he was. A handful of people did, maybe, but he could walk down the street and get a hot dog and no one would care. That was not true anywhere else in the world. I guess what I would say in closing about the future is that I really do feel Bong Joon Ho, in his speech about Parasite, really captured it. That we America, if it only can overcome the sort of 1 inch high boundary, right? And he was speaking specifically of subtitles. But what I would say is that 1 inch high boundary is the boundary of difference, of being different from other people, right? If we can overcome that 1 inch high boundary, then entire worlds open up to us. That has been true. That was true for Everything Ever All at Once. And that is true now for all the films that are coming after. And frankly, I look forward to seeing your guys' reactions to those films and maybe sharing in them somewhere downstream. Because really, I think it's only going to get better from here.
That is a wonderful place to end this.
Thank you so much.
The book is The Golden Screen, the movies that made Asian America. Jeff Yang, forward by Michelle Yeoh, and afterward by John M. Chu. We didn't even talk about Crazy Rich Asians, and that's
Yeah.
got a sequel coming out soon too. Jeff, thank you so much. This has been an honor and a privilege. Wish you all the best with the book going forward.
Thank you, Wade. Thank you, Tim. This has been a blessing. I hope you guys have great holidays, and I look forward to hopefully catching up with you in the new year.
You got it.
Lovely.
All right.